results from a very large-scale reader survey that I undertook with Simon Inga last year. So here you go. Here's all the different routes that readers can take to content. Depending on who they are, depending on whether they're in a library environment or outside of a library environment, they will use a whole host of different types of resources to actually find the publisher's article. Whether that publisher's article is on the publisher's own website or whether it's on an aggregated database such as ProQuest or EBSCO or something similar. There are a whole host of routes to content that researcher or student or librarian can go through. Now, web analytics or weblogs can give us some of the picture, but certainly not all of it. So what can a publisher count? This is what a publisher can understand from their own weblogs. They will know from referrals whether traffic is coming from an abstract and indexing service or a search engine, or whether it's coming from directly from their own site. Or they'll also understand whether content and traffic is coming through a library link server as well. So this is what they can see, and this is what they can count, and this is how they understand the landscape. If we look at what the library can count and what they understand, the picture's very different. So a library can understand, they can count everything that's coming through their own library web environment. So if they're researchers or students or indeed themselves are going through the library web pages and are being intermediated by the library link server, then they can count and understand where traffic is coming from. Obviously, they can't count anything outside that library environment. They rely on your publisher web stats to count that for them. So that's what the library can see. So really, the purpose of showing you that was to show you the purpose really for undertaking this research. We wanted to fill in the gaps. We wanted to understand the whole picture, the whole discovery network, and understand and try and make sense of it for publishers and librarians. So what was it all about? The survey on media navigation. Well, the mission really was to gain a measure of the relative importance of all those channels to inform publishers and information buyers. We actually did this survey twice before. We did it in 2005 and we did it in 2008, and both of which were published in white papers, which are readily accessible. But this time we wanted to do it slightly differently. We wanted to do a much bigger survey. So we changed the business model, we changed the way we did it, and we went out to a lot more people, and we actually had over 19,000 respondents globally. It took us a year in planning and execution and analysis, and thanks to our multitude of supporters, we managed to study a number of subject areas and understand the differences in behaviour, in search and discovery from people in different subject areas. So just a little thank to our supporters there. I know there's some of them in the room here. So we were supported by BMJ, CABI, Cambridge University Press, IOP Publishing, Nature, Palgrave Macmillan, Publishing Technology, RSC and Sage. And the response rates were between 1.7 and 6.4%. Essentially, what our supporters had to do was send out an invitation to the survey to people in their database. So it was an invitation gathering, it was an invitation sending out exercise on their behalf. And here's some of the responses that we had. So we were really keen to get a good geographical breakdown. So responses by region, you'll see the three main split there are North America, Europe and Asia. We had a number of responses in the other regions, but we were really pleased to get so many in those, especially responses from Asia, as we're very interested in looking at the discovery behaviour of researchers and academics in that particular region. So you'll see the three big ones there. In terms of sector, perhaps unsurprisingly given our supporters, predominantly academic. However, we still had well over 1,000 responses from other sectors such as corporate and government and medical, the charity sector being the smallest sector there. So still well over 1,000 responses, so also gives us a statistical enough sample to look at those sectors. In terms of job role, academic researchers took up about half of our responses. But again, lecturers and students were the other two big groups, so we've been able to do a lot of comparison in terms of how the behaviour of students differ to academics, differ to lecturers as well. Again, we did have a number of other responses from different job roles too. Our aim was really to get over 1,000 responses from each of the subject areas that we identified. We achieved that in 6 key subject areas. You'll see this responses are broken down by region and subject area here. And then we had over 600 in another 3 subject areas there. So what we were hoping to do is to get enough responses in each subject area to then further break down the demographical analysis to understand then how chemists, how the difference within chemistry, how they behave for students and lecturers and academic researchers and in different sectors. So for the most part, we achieved that. Okay, just a few limitations. Obviously, it is a survey, so it was bound by the limitations of the questions we asked. And because we redid the survey from 2005 and 2008, we also did want to keep some of the questions the same as, in order to be able to do some trend analysis as well. So although we added some new questions, there were also some questions that we repeated over the years. It was only in English, we didn't translate it. And we used invitations from our supporters because of data protection issues. So all of those had already opted in to receive communications from those publishers and those partners. So obviously, they're already highly engaged, so that could introduce some bias there. So just worth saying some of the limitations for it. What do we look at? Well, we wanted to understand the preference of discovery resources, and through this we identified 3 different types of behaviour when researchers and readers are finding content. We thought about the fact that they will be in search mode when they're searching for articles on a specific subject, or they may be in browse mode when they're looking at the latest articles of their favourite journal, or it may be that they have a specific article that they want to look up. So we asked questions about those 3 types of behaviours. We wanted to know about their search engine preference as well, and also the device preference, and whether there was any difference in preference for using tablets and mobile devices. We asked some questions about apps, and we also wanted to understand about what of their publisher website features they liked best. And then we broke all of this down by region and income, job role, subject area and sector. Okay, so let's look at some of the data. This is a trend analysis here. It's just worth noting that the 2005 and the 2008 research programme projects only really kind of had about 700 or 800 responses each time. So what we've done for the trend analysis data is to downsample the 2012 responses to match those of 2005 and 2008. Because of who our supporters were in the previous years, predominantly the respondents to previous surveys were life scientists, academics in life scientists. So highly funded, probably well-funded one, more so funded than other subject areas, and senior. So we downsampled the 2012 data for this purposes of this trend analysis here. So you'll see the change over time, and this was the starting points for discovering latest articles. So when readers are in browse mode, when they're just trying to keep up to date with what's going on, they're not necessarily searching for something. Where was it they started their search? And we asked them to rank, we asked them to rank these different resources and how important they were. Now you'll see that there was journal alerts are still fairly important in 2012, but not nearly so important as they were in previous years. That's slightly been overtaken by more interest from readers in a publisher's website and the journal's homepage. And also, following on from that, you'll see as the Scholarly Society web pages are also more important for that. And we did wonder whether this was as a result in the explosion really of social media marketing and publishers getting much more engaged with their end users. So we wonder whether that was a positive message for publishers, the fact that they're obviously engaging people much more effectively for people to be going to their site first and foremost. The other interesting thing about this data was that a specialist bibliographic database, and by that we mean an abstract and indexing service, and we actually gave people examples of all these resources depending on the subject area they chose. So we branched the survey. So if people chose life scientists, we'd give them an example of PubMed. If they chose chemistry, we'd give them an example of CASTA. So we gave them very relevant examples so they could help them select the resources that were important to them. So what surprised us that when people were in browse mode, just looking up latest issues, there was a jump in the importance of A&I databases there. There were a few types of resources that we put that we've added this year that we didn't have. So a journal collection such as EBSCO or ProQuest we didn't have in previous years, and there were a couple of resources there that we dropped. The other thing we did is we separated out a general web search engine from a specialist web search engine because there's so much talk at the moment of whether people use Google and Google Scholar, and we wanted to understand that difference in much more detail. So we actually split out that question there. That's why you'll see some gaps in this trend analysis here. So that's the kind of the most important things to say about that really is the slight decline in journal alerts and the slight increase in people actually coming to a journal's website or publisher website, and also a bibliographic database. Library web pages have also held up. They're just as important for people in that mode. Now, if we look at the data for searching, we can see that that graph looks quite different. So the behaviour changes quite significantly depending on what it is that readers are trying to do. So this question said, when you're searching for articles, what is it you do? And again, this is the trend analysis. I'll go into some of the 2012 data in a moment. But you can see that this is highly dominated by the abstract and indexing services. So that hasn't really changed over time. That's where people go. That's the most important resource for these people, and that hasn't changed. What has grown in popularity is the library web pages. So readers are going to the library first, more than they were 7 years ago and 5 years ago. Google Scholar is slightly more important to readers than Google. And again, a journal collection is also up there. Journal's web page and a publisher's a site are kind of important, but nowhere near as important as the kind of the biggies of the ANIs and Google Scholar. So if we look now, if we go into a bit more detail about the 2012 data, we've actually broken this down. We've asked the same question, we've shown you the same results, but we've broken it down to show you just academic researchers in chemistry, humanities and physics. So the blue is chemistry, the red is humanities and the green physics. Again, you can see how the landscape changes quite dramatically depending on the subject area that you're actually working in. So these are researchers, these are senior people. If you're in chemistry, you're finding ANIs much more valuable than the other subject areas. If you're working in humanities, then you're most likely to start in a journal aggregation or on the library web pages, more so than in other subject areas. ANIs are less important for humanities and people working in physics. I won't go into the detail of each one of these, I'll just pick out some of the highlights there. So you can see how that changes. The fact that for researchers in chemistry, a publisher's website is more important than those other subjects areas too. But I think the difference between the humanities and the chemistry in those first three choices there is quite dramatic. Delving in a bit more further again, if we look, because we get asked as consultants, we get asked a lot about full text aggregations and whether publishers should be in them or not in them, and what kind of embargoes they should put on, whether they cannibalise their own content. We get asked that a lot. So I thought this would be interesting to show you the breakdown of subject areas. So this is the same question. So this is showing how relatively important search is of full-text aggregators by subject area. So we can see the physics down there is fairly low, as we saw in the previous graph, and we can see humanities and education researchers value those resources more. But there's quite an even split, as you can see, across the board. Now, does this mean that physicists don't make so much use of aggregations than other subject areas? And is this because archive is perhaps a viable alternative, so why would they start anywhere else? Or is it simply because there isn't a critical mass of physics content in aggregations? Is it just not there and that's why they don't use them? Or is it because they want to search other content types at the same time and so it's not valuable to them, as valuable to them as other subjects area? I don't know. It could be any one of those, it could be none of them, but it raises those questions about why is there that difference between physicists and humanities, for example, in the way that they execute their research. If we look at that same graph now, look at library web pages, again, this is an area where we're heavily involved in talking to publishers about what they should be doing with the library technology providers. We thought we'd also show you this in terms of how users in those different subject areas value the library web pages. And again, actually, library web pages are valued more highly across the board. Again, it's education, humanities are sort of dominating there. But also social science, psychology, agriculture are all valuing library web pages. And as we saw from the previous graphs, library web pages are growing in importance anyway. So this is looking, this is the kind of next question on from this, because we thought, okay, well they've told us what they value, but actually let's just ask them what they were doing when they looked at the last article. So when they accessed the last article, when they read the last article, what was it they were doing? How did they get there? What did they click on? And we gave them these options. So we asked them whether they were following a link in an email from a colleague or a friend. Were they on a social networking site, such as Facebook or LinkedIn? Were they in a bookmark journal? Were they following a journal alert? Were they in a safe search alert? Or were they just searching, generally? Or were they following an article citation? We were really pleased to see that not many people couldn't remember what they were doing when they last looked at an article. So that's really low. We were quite pleased about that. But again, this shows how the differences between people in chemistry and medicine and life sciences. For people in chemistry, journal alerts was just as important as searching. So they were doing that just as much of the time as they were searching. So they were following a link in a journal alert. For people in medicine, journal alerts were much less important than the other subject areas, but more of them were following links in email communications from peers than the other areas. We can see also from this that links on social networking sites aren't being heavily used at the moment. I mean, I'm sure this will grow. This survey was carried out last June, so I'm sure this will grow. But at the time that we took this, not many people had done that as the last thing they'd done. Equally, safe search alerts and bookmarking journals weren't the most popular choices. It's dominated really by searching and journal alerts there. So, all this research shows us that chemists seem to use TOC alerts just as much as search. From the other graphs that we have, we see that chemists seem to like TOC alerts a lot. So what can other subject areas learn from this? Well, we went to go and have a look at some of the chemistry TOC alerts to find out why they were being more heavily used. And one thing that really struck out to me is that they're much prettier than other types of TOC alerts. Now, I don't know whether chemists are attracted by the prettiness of their TOC alerts, or whether that's just me. But they are actually much more visually appealing. They've been using pictures, they're using images. This is from a mobile device looking at ACS, and they're much more appealing, and whether that's part of the reason. What can other subject areas learn from that? I mean, TOC alerts are a valuable mechanism, not just for alerting people to the fact your journal's online, but also as a massively important marketing tool as well. So they're there really to be utilised. So what can you learn from other subject areas? So that's just one example of that. If we look at that data again, and if we look at researchers in North America, Europe and Asia, we see, perhaps not surprisingly, that Europeans and North Americans, researchers in both those territories, act pretty much the same, that there's not much difference between people in those territories. However, for researchers in Asia, they're much more likely to be searching than anything else. And this kind of was borne out between all of the research that we did, really. People in Asia will tend to use search more than any other type of resource. It could be because they don't have the funding in many of the countries in Asia, so they don't have the funding to buy the big ANI services. Or it could be a cultural thing that they would just go to Google first over and above anything else. But as you can see, people in Asia aren't as engaged with the other types of resources as people in North America and Europe are. So on that question of search engines, we then wanted to find out, well, what search engines do you use? So we put Google and Google Scholar, and then we also added the others, Microsoft Academic Search, Yahoo, Bing, Scirus, and Baidu. We're constantly being told that people in China only use Baidu, so we thought, well, we'll test that, and this shows that actually that's clearly not the case. People in China use Google Scholar and Google just as much, in fact more so than other regions around the world, and of course they will use Baidu. But Google and Google Scholar is just as important to people in China as it is anywhere else. So that's comparing US, UK and China there. So let's delve into that in a bit more detail as well. Let's think about the difference between Google and Google Scholar. So what we looked at the data and tried to work out the relative use over Google Scholar by subject. This is again something that we get asked about a lot in the training that we do. Who uses Google Scholar? Why would you use it over and above Google? And this shows that actually we were really surprised by this data. We were surprised by the answers it gave us, because this shows us that people in social sciences and education research will use Google Scholar more so than they'll use Google. People in physics and maths and computer science and chemistry will use Google a lot more than they'll use Google Scholar. And there's some subject areas there that are pretty much even in the spread. Now, we were talking to some social science publishers about this, sort of saying, why do you think that is? And they said perhaps one of the reasons could be that when social scientists and education researchers are searching for content in Google, they find an awful lot of stuff that isn't academic. They find government policy and all sorts of other stuff about education and social sciences that they're not actually looking for. So Google Scholar actually is a much better filter on academic content than Google would be. But we would have thought that that would have been the same for humanities, and it clearly isn't. So we're not quite sure. We're not quite sure why that is, because often social science and humanities results really kind of tracked each other, but that doesn't there. That's one thing that hasn't. So that would be an interesting thing to talk to some humanities publishers and social scientists about that. But essentially, this shows that people in the sciences are still using Google over and above. They're using Google a lot more than they're using Google Scholar. So is this further evidence that physicists want to search other contents at the same time? They don't want to be restricted to the academic journals, they don't want to be restricted to academic content. But is that also a valid reason for the difference in behaviour between social science and humanities as well? So finally, on the last bit to do with our graphs, this is the last chart, I promised you. We thought you'd be interested in seeing something about the features. So we asked what features do you find useful in publishers' e-journal websites. Now, I haven't shown you the trend analysis for this, but I can tell you that 2012 results showed everything was less important than it was 5 years ago and 7 years ago. People are using features on publisher websites a lot less. Now, of course, this probably is because, as we know, researchers are landing on the article page more than anywhere else in the publisher website. They're using a discovery resource, they're finding the article, they're getting the article, and they're going again. Now, publishers are making great strides in building much more information and features and the bells and whistles into that article page. But we wondered whether that was kind of being borne out by the research to show that actually people are valuing some of those features a lot less than they were in 2005 and 2008. But that aside, let's have a look at this data. And actually, something to say about that trend. The two areas where we had seen an increase in people finding more interest in than they had 7 years ago were the news and editor's choice. So it was the more content-rich features that they were interested in. But just briefly here, because I've been told I've got 5 minutes, are that talk alerts are much less of interest to physicists, but they're much more interested in the manuscript submission and the reference linking and cited by features, or slightly more anyway. And talk alerts, again, life scientists and chemistry, they'll come to your site to pick up talk alerts for those. So anyway, that's just a little interesting aside really to show you the difference in features. Now, personalisation, discussion list, RSS feeds are not particularly of value. I know some of you have to have them, but they're not of particular value to the people that we surveyed here. Okay, so that's just giving you a very sort of brief overview really of the whole amount of data that we had at our disposal. It took me longer to work out what to show you than it did to do it probably. But that's filled in some of those gaps. It's filled in some of those gaps to understand the difference between students and researchers and what resources they're using in what mode. So what to do about it? What's the point? Well, I think the key point really is that you need to support all of the discovery channels that your clients, and by these we mean libraries and readers, want to use. And I think just a point here, sort of following on from this morning's session, when I say publishers, I mean OA publishers as well as subscription publishers. It is just as important for open access publishers to be in the library discovery layers, to be working with the knowledge bases from the link servers, to be thinking about being in Discovery and Primo and EDS and all those other big web-scale discovery tools. It's just important for OA publishers to be there because that's about discovery. You're not going to be discovered if you're not in all the big places where researchers find content. Obviously you need to support all the ANIs and all the other types of resources that your readers and your users use to find content. But you also need to understand how different reader types discover and access your content. I mean, if you're a multidisciplinary publisher, then that's interesting because you want to be able to segment your marketing in such a way to attract, to focus on different reader types. But also, if you're a single subject publisher, to really understand where your users are coming from and how they're using the different resources to get to your site. Gives you the potential to expose more sophisticated discovery information to key channels, so you can choose what you want to expose to those different channels, but also differentiate through which discovery channels to make subscriber offers. So, for example, you could be playing around with the idea of making certain articles free through certain channels, especially if you know they're heavily used. You could put, do you want to make it free for 24 hours or 48 hours if you then go and cite that further. So there's lots of different ways that you can then start promoting articles by making them freely available through different channels. But understanding the landscape is going to be key to be able for you to be making those effective decisions. So that's it. Am I there? Timing. So just a little note about it. The summary report is available for free on our website. It's got all of the demographics and most of the trend charts that I showed you there. The full report contains about 90 charts and 123 pages, and we've also got full data available as well. I've got questions there, but I think we're going to take them after Michael's session as well. So I'll hand over to Michael. Thank you.